Hello, all you fellow Dusty Dogs and Travelers of the Trail out there. My name is Dusty Yote, and welcome to D.I.Yote Bites, a bite-sized audio podcast-style series where I ramble for a bit about me, my life, and my interests. On today's episode, I'll talk about how I first got into my major creative pursuit of writing and the initial difficulties of getting into the practice. Enjoy! The first moment I ever wanted to write was in 5th grade. My little Southern California Christian elementary school, about one classroom per grade, was rather well-rounded so far as my education went. Got a basic course in all the major areas of study, though notably without much on evolution, and even had quite the extracurricular program. Among these was art, culminating in an art fair held at the end of the school year that showed off our various mediums. I myself was never very good at the visual arts. Try as I might, I could never really understand colors and textures and shapes with my hands. I did get 2 honorable mentions at the art fair that were more than just participation awards, but they were primarily childish in nature, and to this day I can barely do more than a scribble. But I did like going to the art fair and looking at everyone else's pieces. It may in part be my beginning of a love of art museums, wandering around and looking for my friends at the stuff that other people did hung on the walls, or displayed around the school's general use hall. 6th graders at my school had to do this special project called Larger Than Life. Students were required to take an object, any old object they wanted, and blow it up to either 5 or 10 times its original size. I dreaded the moment, mostly because I was terrible at art, and why would you expect someone like that to accurately blow up an object that size when they can barely get the proportions right on paper? When I was in 5th grade, I didn't have to do it. I did have a friend who was in 6th grade, the kid of one of my parents' friends, who they frequently hung out with at the time, and so we often hung out together at such large events and parties. And she had an entry. When I recognized her name as one of the projects, I was suitably intrigued. Not only because she was a good artist, but because she had done something with the art project that I'd never seen before. Most kids did stuff like pencils and erasers or coins, but she did a book, blown up 5 times its size and standing about 4 feet tall, with its own specially designed cover and a unique little blurb to go on the back. Even before the writing part, I thought it sounded cool. It was about these anthropomorphic cats that went around in space trying to find these special items to save the universe, or something like that. I can't remember the specific details of it. I found my friend and asked her if she had based it off a series she knew. Was it an actual series and title, something she just came up with for the project? What was the inspiration behind that book cover? Turns out she was writing the first draft of the book in question. I was floored. I was 11, she was 12, and she was already writing a whole book about these cats in space. This is something that blew my mind. To hear about my friend, who wasn't even a teenager, writing a book, I just thought this was the coolest thing ever. This was the first time I ever had the idea of writing as this thing that I wanted to do. I wanted to make my own universes like that. I wanted to make my own characters and have them go on all these amazing adventures. I wanted to make my own worlds and write stories. It was just the best thing ever. I did have some inclinations beforehand. I wrote what could be described as fan fiction long before I knew what fan fiction was, making self-insert stories about video games that I had played. I stapled pieces of paper together, scribbled down some loosely connected ideas, and was proud of this book that had unfinished ideas and some 10 or so blank pages. But being so young, for me it was just play, never anything serious had been involved quite yet. The funny thing about this was I asked my friend if I could read her book. She said she'd bring it over the next time our families got together. So, of course, the next time that happened, it was a few months down the road, and both of us totally forgot about it. But my designs of writing didn't disappear so easily. Part of our 6th grade literature curriculum was a series of creative writing prompts, 1 per month, that we had to finish with short stories. I remember the first few times I did it were very weird. One in particular was basically a self-insert fan fiction of a video game I really liked at the time. It was awesome and allowed me to start venting some of those creative urges that I had. Even with the weird ones, I remember getting A's on all those creative writing assignments, so it must have paid off at least a little bit. I did manage to remember my friend's book some 2 years later when I was in the 7th grade. We were at the house of a mutual family friend for dinner, and I saw her with this open notebook filled with paper and asked her if she was doing homework. She replied no, it was her own book. I finally remembered the whole art fair thing and asked if I could see it. If I was amazed by the pure concept of my friend's idea, It was another thing entirely to see it as a work in progress. It was 324 pages of size 14 point and double-spaced work, filled with purple prose all over the place, but still a thing of beauty to me. I remember reading through the book absolutely fascinated, even if some of the paragraphs were a page or so in length. I mean, we're talking not just about color and style, but the way a character's hair was described exactly the way it would or would not sit on their shoulders. I became quickly engrossed in the character details, the wide open spaces of the desert planet of the first few chapters. And I loved the story very much. I remember one other thing. The pages were filled with notes. Back when I had initially voiced my interest at the art fair, she had just completed the first draft. 2 years later, she had filled every page with edits. Between the lines, on the sides, in the margins, even drawn on the text itself. Yet I didn't see it as messy. I saw it as a labor of love, or at least the product of many years of hard work and dedication. Even the process fascinated me when it came to writing and editing. And seeing the work and dedication that was put into this work, much larger than the simple stories I'd been writing, the flame was definitively lit. It was around this time that I began my first attempt at a major work, which I christened The Chronicles of Arkan. It was about this boy from a town in the fictional country of Arkan, who would discover by accident a plot by this evil lord to take over and steal the magic from the country. He would go around defeating the evil lord's forces with a handful of companions and would learn the country's secrets, eventually using them to defeat the lord in combat. Yes, it was very much based on role-playing video games, but that's what I was heavily into at the time, and some have very fascinating stories. I think I went through about 20 or so different incarnations of the Chronicles of Arkan between 2005 and 2009. It was one of those ideas that I'd suddenly have the urge to write and have this amazing new idea of how to go about it. Go for 60 to 100 pages, and then suddenly everything would just dry up and nothing would work. I probably had written over 1 million words by the time I turned 17, simply because I would pile it all up and throw it away to start afresh over and over again. A few things stayed constant. I always inserted things I loved. 2 characters were dogs. 1 a wolf, because I loved wolves and dogs now instead of mostly cats. And 1 a German shepherd dog, because that was the closest thing to a wolf I probably could have as a pet. I always had a forest, because I loved going camping in the San Bernardino Mountains by our California home. Sometimes I included a dragon, but it was always an Oriental-inspired dragon, because I loved the big snakes whenever we went to the zoo. But every version had something different. 1 had a talking tiger with access to fire magic. 1 was straight-up medieval in setting, that sort of thing. Sometimes even the world itself was different, either in how magic was done, or what character appeared where, under what circumstances. Once I even changed the whole format of the world itself, going from a single island to a whole chain. It was like a jigsaw puzzle more than anything else, putting in pieces and trying to see what fit where with what circumstances my mind decided to pull out. I couldn't really explain why none of them worked, but it was always something different. This one didn't have enough detail. That one had a shoddy romance subplot. Another had a weakly pulled-off villain. Another went into odd fetish territory, even though I didn't understand what that was quite yet. It was rather pure until I was almost done with high school in about 2010. But nothing settled right about it, and none of them were ever finished. I think the closest I ever got was about the halfway point, and even then I ended up throwing that version out. The other part of that is I don't really understand why I kept going with it either. Drive probably had something to do with it. Being so persistent about making it my own, I would work on it even when the going seemed tough. Stubbornness, too, only taking setbacks lying down for a day or two when I realized I didn't quite want to work on giving up the idea just yet. That being said, while I would love to have an epic like the Chronicles of Arkan someday, I don't think that's quite the way I'd like to go about it. It would either turn out more like a video game or very much like the things I didn't like about it. As I've gone through so many incarnations, nothing feels right anymore. I also remember my mother during those times scolding me quite heavily. I was printing out something like 20 or 30 pages a week of non-school related material because I was obsessed with seeing it in print, only to throw it in the recycle a few weeks later when it ground to a halt. An all too common problem in our house was that I would have a paper due in a few days, and we'd always be buying an ink cartridge or printer paper at the last second because I'd recently used the last of it on my perpetually unfinished book. Because of this, I don't think any of them survived very long in our house. Either my mother would have me throw it away if I wasn't doing anything with it anymore, or I would throw it away to hide it and feign ignorance about where the paper went. I think that contributed to me stopping work on it eventually. The artist who crumples the paper and throws it over his shoulder isn't so glamorous an idea when you want to write a novel and realize you're throwing out reams of paper at a time. I probably would have stopped entirely if it wasn't for something that happened in 2008. By then I was frequenting the internet on the casual basis fairly often, prior usage being mostly for school research due to shitty internet quality, and eventually found my way to DeviantArt. I think I was browsing pictures on Google when I found it, looking for the source for a piece of art, and was immediately enamored by the concept, so I joined. I was really into wolves, still am, though majority interest has traveled elsewhere, and found a lot of artists that I liked on that site who drew wolves. A rather large subset of that was anthropomorphic art, with 3 artists in particular guarding the focuses of my attention for their designs. One, I believe it was Golden Wolf, was closer to feral. One, Luthien Nightwolf, was closer to humanoid. And one, I believe it was Christian Jaguar, was somewhere in the middle. At the time, I had no idea what anthropomorphic meant. My favorite video game series contains an anthropomorphic bandicoot, but if you asked me then what those words meant, I wouldn't have been able to give you a good definition of either. Back then, I just saw wolves and werewolves and thought, cool, I like this stuff. And upon reflection, I'd been dealing with a fair few anthropomorphic characters prior to this. So it was only natural that I gravitated towards that kind of thing. Early in 2009, a few of them began to complain they weren't receiving a lot of views due to the content of their art, and were moving to a new site. For Affinity. I watched first one go, then the second, then the third. And with my 3 favorite artists gone, DeviantArt didn't hold too much for me anymore. Not for a while, at least. I wouldn't go back for almost 8 years. I hesitated over the decision for quite a while, but eventually I followed them over because I wanted to see more of their art. A first, safe for work, glance showed it was similar to DeviantArt, but with more species thrown into the mix. And I decided I would log in. I think creating an account on Fur Affinity was my first time seeing explicit-oriented artwork. I don't know if it's because I'm not a particularly sensual person to begin with, or possibly being demisexual, but it was kind of gross to look at first. Of course, some people might see that as being sensible. It took me a bit of time, but I found out how to make it where the explicit stuff was gone, and I was able to browse in relative comfort. I kept mature-rated stuff, partly because of mild violence and action stuff, but I was still relatively pure at the time, even if I was finding the other type of mature, no sex, but still sensual, increasingly more interesting. I found a few more artists besides the 3 I'd followed from DeviantArt, and loved their stuff, and decided that I wanted to grab a piece of that for my own, too. But of course, my art was still shit. Any hand I make looks like a frickin' baseball glove for a cartoon character that just got stung by a wasp. So I wrote stories about them. I wrote a fantasy about a wolf witch that enchanted the woods around her place so that all paths would lead to her and trap them within. I wrote a love story about a wolf character who had a female lover but got attracted to a male skunk, and his deliberation over who he should be with. I could not do art, so I wrote stories. I created a lead character for the fantasy who showed up in the love story, and it slowly became my first persona, a dark-colored anthropomorphic wolf. Initially dismissed on DeviantArt, my time on Fur Affinity, I learned about the negative opinions of furries and people who like anthropomorphic artwork in general. I heard about bad, read naughty, stuff that happened at conventions, the predilections for NSFW art, and the overall sexual nature. Let's say I hadn't seen it, or at least it had hidden away a good majority of it. But with less than a year's exposure under my belt, I decided they can't be that bad, justifying that with that I'd never heard or seen any of it until I came to the site. Thankfully, one of my friends in high school decided he was interested in it too, and we decided to go to a nearby furry convention in the summer of 2009. My friend was an artist and brought along a notebook. I brought along a camera, having recently gotten into photography. So with some spare cash and a backpack to carry around some basics in, we set off. I don't know why my brain worked like that, but I'm certainly glad it did. I'm pretty sure the genesis of most of my jar ideas came from that moment. My friend and I went to California in 2009, the summer just after my junior year, with my parents taking us to the convention and spending the rest of the day somewhere else in Anaheim. The convention was in a hotel, taking up a few large conference rooms in a hallway, with some activity spilling out into a bar in the hotel's communal lounge area. The effect was, as soon as we'd pulled into the parking lot and into the front doors, there were a bunch of people dressed up as different animals, with cat ears or dog tails. My friend and I went down the hallway, already ogling the suits and artists before we'd even entered one of the main rooms, got in line to receive our badges, and began to explore. It was probably one of the more jarring experiences in my life, and I say that in a good way. I'm a major introvert, and I do not like being around huge crowds for long periods of time. But I also swear I've never met a nicer group of people. The people in costumes were also open to me with my camera, taking photos like a tourist, posing for dynamic shots. I even met a quadruped suit. Someone managed to make a suit where they bent over and walked on like a four-legged animal. It looked like a massive wolf that came up and nosed my hand for pets. My friend was an artist, and he enjoyed walking around the artist end, talking to various people there. And they really respected your space. There were so many people in suits and out who were open to hugs, but none of them would hug you unless you were okay with it and gained your permission. It also became a time of debunking some of those myths. The NSFW stuff was kept mostly to one corner of the artist den and pretty much not allowed out of that area. The whole thing was highly regulated and was no different from what I'd heard from my friends' experiences at places like Comic-Con. Also, no one would want to have sex in a suit, or most of them, because most people pay $1,200 or more for one and don't want to ruin it. Many needing tons of care and even the slightest situations of wear and tear. I honestly swear the experiences changed me for the better. They made me realize I couldn't just base my opinions purely off of what other people had said, that I needed to really look into things first before I make any judgments. And it's a situation that's occurred multiple times in my life in various different contexts. This was a group that was somewhat reviled by the media by the time I had found them, but the actuality was nothing like what I'd heard and seen in the media prior to going. Different didn't mean depraved. A lesson I probably really needed to learn, coming from a semi-conservative Christian congregation that occasionally defaulted to that. And so in 2009 I began a new novel entirely. I ditched the Chronicles of Arkin, and made a story about a boy who hears stories about werewolves, but wonders if they're really true. He also feels alone, feeling different and unsure if he fits in, and decides to make something of himself by seriously deciding on this undertaking. He sets off on a journey to uncover the mysteries about it and ends up not only learning some things about himself, begins to change the minds of people by uncovering the truths. This was my first novel, true novel, Night of the Silver Moon. I might have liked anthropomorphic art before, but going to California is probably the point where I became a furry, in addition to finding something else. Something different happened this time. I had not only an idea, I had a purpose. I think a purpose is good in writing. It doesn't have to be based on lofty motives, but it certainly makes a difference to write something that has some driving force behind it. You put yourself into it more if you feel invested in the payoff. Here, the purpose was placing my own feelings of insecurity and difference from others, and making a story about finding somewhere I actually felt comfortable expressing those. A place outside that friend group where I actually found something I liked in common with other people. In some senses, then, it's very difficult to write without some sort of social commentary. You can, but the process is harder for me for some reason without being based on something that means something to me. It doesn't have to be direct, either. But in this case, using anthropomorphic characters allowed me to state my opinions in a more allegorical sense. Which, though naive and definitely youthful in many ways, ended up being what Night of the Silver Moon is. Statements on the feeling of ostracism of the other and why that was wrong and counterproductive. told through a fantasy story about a boy who can't put his finger on why the stories of the werewolf of legend just don't make sense. And I don't claim that all my novels are from lofty motives. I think that's nearly impossible, if only because so few people can really be and remain lofty in nature. It's also difficult to do so constantly without coming across as preachy or hypocritical. We're flawed human beings, but if writing can point out the flaws and hope to serve even as a warning, it's worth something. As of this recording, I've been writing now as a steady hobby for close to 15 years. I've self-published 3 books that are now non-canon, and I'm preparing a 6th canonical novel, making 9 novels and almost 750,000 words published work since 2012, with a few more in the wings that are in progress. The writing life is not the easiest one, but I thank the fandom for being my muse. I've even mostly broke even with my sales, so I would count that as a success. And hopefully things become a little less rocky in the future, even though I'd have my beginnings for it in no other way. And that has been your bite-sized nugget of storytelling for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and it amused you as much as it amuses me. If you liked hearing me ramble, hit the like button on the video, and hit subscribe for the channel to be notified when the next bite-sized episode comes out. You can also support the series by donating to my Ko-fi page, kofi.com/D.I.Yote_gaming. But for now, it's time for me to head out. So until we meet again on these dusty trails, have a howling good day. Take care.